Alec, Mark and I have talked about this, and we both hesitate to use the term sleeping giant to describe what Illinois could be. But given the recruiting footprint, Illinois, it would be on my probably top 5 in all of the Power 5 for most underachieving programs in the country this century. We know the vaunted Illinois defenses of the 20th century, but as far as the recruiting landscape, Brett Bielema Lovie Smith had it as well, and he wasn't really able to really get over the hump. But I do think that the West, as it relates to coaching, is in as good of a position as it's ever been. And I don't think that's really up for debate. Mark, can we agree on that? Across the board, whether you're talking PJ Fleck or Kirk or Ferentz or Brom, I think it's and then Pat, we're not even talking about Pat Fitzgerald, who probably is the best coach, right up there certainly with Kirk and I think PJ. So how confident are Illini fans right now, having a year into this experiment with Brett? Is it a year now? He's only been there a year, correct?
Yeah, fully.
My time frame messed up. I know there was some attrition with the transfer portal, which I think is somewhat normal, especially this early into a guy's tenure there. I remember looking back at the numbers early, and I looked at Iowa compared to the rest of the Big Ten, and Illinois had lost a ton of guys and had gotten like nobody, which was a concern. I was concerned about Iowa at the time because they hadn't really gotten anybody, but the difference is they hadn't really lost anybody either, and Illinois was in a weird position. But you explained to me before we went live that Brett kind of takes a different approach to the portal. So how do Illini fans kind of perceive Illinois right now? Because of course they've got a gauntlet playing in this division, and I don't know what they're out of. I need to pull up their out of division lineup as well. But how do fans perceive the program at this point?
I think that there's a cautious optimism. Like there's a positive energy about Illinois football that maybe didn't exist for a long time. I think you think back to like the 2019 4-game win streak to kind of end the season, not really end the season. They did lose the last couple games that year, but to go to a bowl game, that just kind of felt fugazi, I guess, a little bit. It felt like there was a lot of luck involved to beat the number 6 team in the country in Wisconsin, to have the largest comeback in school history, a 28-3 comeback on the road at Michigan State. Like those are kind of lucky wins, right? And like those happen all the time in college football, but to have that happen twice in a span of 4 weeks is pretty lucky. But Coach Bielema seems to do a really good job of just kind of communicating and being like a figurehead that Lovie Smith wasn't for Illinois fans, right? Like he's out in the community. He's active on social media. He's always talking about family. And, like this past week, they're posting videos on social media of the entire team playing paintball on the outdoor practice facility. Like he does things that make it feel like a college program, I think, for the players. And the players love him. They love his coaching staff. They just rave about the type of person he is. And that's not to say that they didn't do that stuff with Lovie Smith, but I think now it feels more like a college program to the players. And I think the fans kind of see that too, because they see that there's just more energy and it's more positive. And of course, like there's the things that come out last year during the season about what he said about the offensive line, which like was true and it was taken out of context, but like he is, in my opinion, doing a good job, at least in his first year and a half now on the job. And I understand they didn't go to a bowl game last year and they had 2 or 3 pretty frustrating losses, I think, in the minds of a lot of fans, and decisions to not go for it on 4th and short against Maryland and Purdue. And I think back-to-back weeks potentially cost Illinois back-to-back wins. And that obviously really hurt them. But there was marked improvement based off what they did last year. That it was a team that routinely got blown out by teams across the Big Ten with Lovie Smith. And last year they only got blown out twice. They lost on the road early in the year to a Virginia team that has a pretty explosive offense. Brennan Armstrong, he's coming back again this year. And Virginia does come to Champaign. It's a home and home. And then they also got blown out by Wisconsin 24-0 in Champaign. And that was one of their uglier offensive performances. And I don't think they actually gained over 100 total yards in that game. And that game is one of the games I think that probably led to offensive coordinator Tony Peterson being fired after just 1 year. We can talk about that a little bit later too, if you guys want. But overall, it felt like a pretty positive first year under Brett Bielema. And I think there's some positive momentum going into the second season. And while like last year's recruiting class, the 2022 class, wasn't the most highly ranked or highly touted in the country, you look at what he did with classes at Wisconsin, and it's kind of one of those situations where it's going to be a developmental program. It's going to be a lot of players are maybe 3 lower 4 stars. They're not going to recruit a lot of 5 stars. They're probably not going to land a lot of 5 stars, maybe even high 4 stars. That's just not something Illinois football is in a position to do. But he wants to find players, develop them with a staff that has a good track record of doing that, and kind of model it, guys, after what Iowa has been able to do under Kirk Ferentz. And that's obviously where Brett Bielema learns his college football, I guess, formulas. I mean, under Hayden Fry and then eventually Kirk Ferentz.
I am curious. Has Tommy DeVito been named the starter as of right now?
Yeah, he hasn't been named the starter officially, but I do expect him to be the starting quarterback.
Okay.
Art Sikowski is the other one who is going to be considered in that quarterback battle. I don't expect Ryan Johnson to be in that conversation, but Sikowski had to get 2 offseason surgeries, one on a broken wrist that he hurt at the end of that Penn State game, the one Illinois won.
Shoulder. The other one was a shoulder, right?
Yeah. Well, he had to get a broken wrist, and then he also had to get shoulder surgery. I believe it's for a torn labrum. Don't quote me on that. It was an injury.
I'll tell you. So I don't want to interrupt you, but I just interviewed Tony Rasiopi yesterday, who's his private instructor, and he told me it was actually the labrum and the rotator cuff. So that's
cool. Yeah, I didn't know it was rotator cuff. But yeah, he played through that all of last year. Didn't tell any of his teammates. The only coaches I knew, I'm pretty sure, were Bielema and the offensive. So he'll have an opportunity to battle for it, but I do expect DeVito to win the job.
So obviously that's going to be an interesting battle, and I know Tony is a huge Art Sikowski fan, understandably so, given that he's his private instructor. That makes sense. I think Iowa fans, this is another one of those games that maybe I'm just a worrywart, but I look at the last 2 years, and Iowa very easily could have lost in 2020 at Illinois. I mean, that was a game that I think...
You're thinking 2019 in Iowa City. They got blown out in Champaign in 2020.
Well, they got blown out. Well, they ended up getting blown out, but as I recall, at halftime, Illinois was ahead, if I'm not mistaken.
They might have been. They started that game up, I think, 14-0, and then just completely stalled. Yeah,
they did, and that's kind of been Illinois' MO. But last year, the same thing. I mean, last year had Charlie Jones not popped off the kick return for a touchdown, I think it was in the second quarter. Those games where Iowa struggled, and there were times where Iowa struggled defensively against Illinois. I do wonder with Illinois' rushing attack, it's been one of the more underrated rushing attacks, not only in the Big Ten, but in the country for quite some time. And I do wonder, given Brett's track record, I think of back at his time at Wisconsin and some of the wrinkles that he would show against Iowa. And I'm not saying that he's not going to show wrinkles against other teams, because he did when he was at Wisconsin. I'm sure he'll do it again. But I do wonder if we're going to see something surprising, given the matchup of Brett versus his old team. I think that's something that Iowa fans should expect. Your thoughts on Brett and his imagination, maybe compared to a Lovie Smith.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. He didn't get a chance to coach against Iowa last year. He had tested positive for COVID, so he didn't make the trip to Iowa City. And I think there's obviously an animosity between Illinois football fans and Iowa football fans, but I think it's more strongly on the Illinois basketball side with Iowa basketball fans. But there definitely is still like a disdain. And you said it pretty well earlier. An underrated rivalry, I feel like, is a good way to say it for each program. I think that Bielema, especially on the offensive side, is getting more creative this offseason. With the hiring of Barry Lenny Jr., the new offensive coordinator, he comes Illinois from UTSA. They had a really explosive offense down there. The Roadrunners did. They were obviously one of the better Group of 5 programs. I think they were undefeated until the last.
Illinois found that out the hard way.
Yes, they did. Jakari Franklin tore them apart. Just to name a name, he was a receiver for them. And he hires Barry Lenny Jr., guy who has connections with dating back to their time at Arkansas. He was actually a tight ends coach that Bielema hired at Arkansas. And he runs a 10 pro offense. Essentially it's a pro style offense with tempo, but they're also going to do some things in the no huddle, which is definitely something that you didn't see last year Illinois do at all. They were even under center a lot last year under Tony Peterson. And that's something that I don't think you're going to see very much, maybe at all this year, outside of certain packages, maybe goal line packages, 4th and goals, whatever it may be. So you're kind of looking at, with Coach Bielema, maybe a modernization of what he wants to do offensively. And I think that's something that's needed. You kind of look at what a lot of the more successful offenses are doing, not just in the Big Ten, but also across the entire country. I think it's really hard, especially in Illinois' case. They're trying to model themselves off of Iowa and Wisconsin. It's hard to beat Iowa and Wisconsin at Iowa and Wisconsin's own game, right? Like they've been doing that for 20, 30 years at this point in each program's case. And I think what Bielema is trying to do now is find the players, develop them, speaking on the offensive side of the ball, but put them in a position to maybe modernize the offense a little bit, speed the game up a little bit, play with a little bit of maybe spread principles at times, but also still have the pro style principles that I've come to know with Brett Bielema in his time as a college head coach.
Mark, you're a big Brett Bielema fan. You have anything to add to this conversation? I know you're a big Brett Bielema fan because I recall a discussion you and I had, I want to say summer of 2021, just discussing him at Illinois. And I remember coming onto the show. For some reason, this stands out. I made a comment about how Brett really didn't get it done down at Arkansas, and you came to his defense. Just your take on Bielema.
Yeah, I did. Of course, a difficult situation playing in that division with what he took over, and he had it all moving in the right direction for a long time there before it turned ugly on him. And really, it was one bad season that got him fired. You know, he was only 1 year removed from 7-5, and Arkansas went in another direction, and that was not a good direction for the next 3 or 4 years. But now they're in a different place. What I found interesting about what Bielema had to say once he got the Illinois job, Alec, was that, he certainly had his core values from a football standpoint, core values in the running game and tough-mindedness and all those things we see from Brett Bielema and have through his Wisconsin and Arkansas experiences, but that he learned a lot going to the NFL and realized that football had changed and that you could still bring a lot of those foundational values, but you needed to adapt. Do you see that happening in the program and with the offense in particular?
Yeah, he talks a lot about how much he learned from Coach Belichick with the Patriots. He was only on that staff for a year or two, but he did win a Super Bowl there. He does have a Super Bowl ring, which is pretty cool, obviously. He did. He talks a lot about that and that learning experience and how he's brought a lot of that to college. And I think one area that you really see that, and this is a year and a half removed now, when he first came to Illinois and he was building the staff, not just the coaching staff, but the entire support staff, when you talk about the recruiting staff and just other positions on the staff, he hired a high school relations coach or a high school relations person. And that person is Pat Ryan. He's a legendary high school coach in the state of Illinois. And that essentially Ryan's main job is to just develop relationships with high school coaches across the state of Illinois. And Bielema's biggest thing since he came to Illinois is in-state recruiting. We want to own the state, put a fence around the state. And because that's what Lovie Smith didn't do. I mean, it's pretty famous in 2020. Illinois didn't sign a single player from the state of Illinois. And for Illinois to be successful in Coach Bielema's eyes, they need to be able to recruit the state really well and have a lot of the principles of Illinois high school football players within their program. So I think you've seen a lot of that in terms of the way Coach Ryan has kind of helped build that. But then you also see him have a recruiting position designed mostly for in-state, but then they also have someone who just scours the portal all the time. And then they have your traditional director of recruiting. And then they also have a director of pro relations. They have all of these different spots and all of these different roles. And I'm not trying to compare him to Nick Saban because that's definitely not an apt comparison to make for what they both accomplished on the field. But think back to what Nick Saban did when he got to Alabama and kind of the early part of the 2010s, right? He hires all these analysts, and all these analysts aren't getting paid a whole lot of money, but they allow the coaches on the staff to not have to handle as much of the dirty work that's maybe not as important. And these analysts are able to learn all these different things. And then they turn into guys like Billy Napier, right? And the guys that Bielema's hiring aren't going to do the same thing, but they're hired in roles that allow the assistant coaches and him to focus more on the things that they need to focus on, whether that's recruiting, whether that's game day preparation, whether that's actually coaching in a game or building relationships with the players. Like, those are all things that these different people on the staff are allowed to do. And in terms of what he's learned offensively, I think it kind of goes back a lot to what he learned last year at Illinois in his first year. I think he came in, he wanted to try and do a lot of the same things that he did at Wisconsin, what Iowa has kind of done for a long time with Tony Peterson, a guy he had a relationship with dating back to when Peterson was the offensive coordinator, co-offensive coordinator at Minnesota when they were one of the more potent rushing attacks in the Big Ten around the mid-2000s era. You kind of look at a thing here where Bielema realized that didn't work, and he completely changed it. And it's rare to see a head coach fire an offensive coordinator after just one season, and not only do that, but to do it when it's a full-scale rebuild of the program. And he's been open in saying that, and what his goal is to sustain success. Like, he needs to make Illinois that. That's what he needs to do in his eyes. That's athletic director Josh Whitman's goal. And he believes that, like, this new offensive coordinator and this new scheme is going to better set them up to be more successful consistently on offense and take a lot of the pressure off of the defense, which made huge strides last year and the first year of Ryan Walters.
I will say this, the schedule for Illinois, I would say it's more difficult opening up than Iowa's is. You get that same Virginia team. I know Indiana was dreadful last year, but you have to go on the road. I expect that. I expect the Hoosiers to be better with Connor Bazelak, and Wyoming is dealing with weird issues as well. I don't know that I'm qualified enough to speak on their problems, but I do think they're going to be battle tested heading into the Iowa game. I think Iowa on the schedule for them coming off the Michigan game, who knows when that game's going to be played. We've seen Iowa. I don't want to call them hangovers. I think of the 2017 game against Ohio State, where Iowa just dominates at home and then they run into a buzzsaw. They don't score a single point offensively at Illinois the very next week. So I'm not saying that's going to happen here. But I will say this. You brought up something, Alec, about Brett Bielema and Illinois not trying to necessarily beat Iowa and Wisconsin at their own game. If anybody's going to do it, it might be Brett, though, because I mean, let's be honest. He did that a lot at Wisconsin against the Hawks. So, yeah, you may not be able to do it this year. I think you're right. I think that in my opinion, that's the right approach. You're going to have to develop these guys over the course of several years, especially if you're trying to develop kids at a high school. So you may have to win different ways your first year, 2, or even 3. So I think that's going to be fascinating to see the wrinkles, because I do expect to see some of those wrinkles in this game. I will say this, just add in, and if there's anything else from Mark, and we can let Alex slide. But Iowa did just get a commitment today from Cannon Leonard. I brought him up earlier, right up the road from Champaign, and I know Illinois was in on him, did not offer, but he just committed to Iowa. Just thoughts on that, Alec? And are you surprised at all that Illinois didn't offer? Iowa was the only Power 5 to offer.
Yeah, I think they actually got in with an offer over the weekend. I could be wrong.
They did, okay.
Well, I could be wrong there. I know they showed interest. They actually signed his older brother, Clayton Leonard, who isn't as highly touted of a prospect. And we were talking maybe a little bit before the show, right as we started, that Clayton's little brother, Cannon, is about 6'9".
Yeah.
And that's obviously something that was really attractive to Illinois, especially at tackle. And he's a 2024 prospect, correct?
3. He's 23.
Okay, so he's a 2023 prospect. So I think one of the reasons why Illinois probably didn't show a whole lot of interest in this was largely because they've already kind of filled up on what they're looking for in the offensive line in the 2023 class. And that's just kind of one of those things where you only have so many bodies that you can take. And even though the NCAA kind of has given relief on this new thing with not just 85 and there's not the 25 limit, but they've already taken a few offensive linemen. They've taken TJ McMillan. He's a center, probably going to be a starter for Illinois for a few years. I'm pretty high on him. And then they've also taken a few others, and Zachary Amlin. He's someone from New Jersey. Took Rico Jackson. And there's another kid down from East St. Louis. That's an area where Illinois really wants to recruit harder down there. One of the more talented programs in the entire state. I don't know how well-versed you guys are in East St. Louis football, but it's a pretty talented program. They have a prospect that Illinois would probably end up taking another offensive lineman for because they want to build relationships with that program. But when you think about the idea of passing on Leonard or maybe not pushing as hard for Leonard, it might have been a situation where they felt like they had other prospects higher on their board. And like you kind of said earlier, there's a rawness to that. Yeah, he's got the size, but he maybe doesn't have the weight that they're looking for on the offensive line. Illinois is really trying to get big on the offensive line. Think Wisconsin when it comes to what Illinois wants to be on the offensive line. Minnesota too. That's a really good. Yeah, Minnesota's offensive line last year was one of the largest groups of people I've ever seen in my life. Yeah. And I think it's one of those things where you can only take so many people. And while offensive line is really important, and that's what Brett Bielema was kind of largely known for in his tenure, the decision to maybe not push there might have been also just because they felt Iowa was going to get him all along. I mean, there's one of those situations where sometimes other schools don't offer. I don't have a lot of direct insight on that specific recruitment, but I know that his older brother Clayton is someone that they kind of view as maybe a little bit more of a project, and they've already got other guys in this offensive line class. But it's hard to pass on 6'9", a tackle, right? Like that's always impressive.
And I'll just say this: I said it at the outset, and I'm sure once you get off Alec, we'll probably dive into this more. But what happens if he grows 2 inches more? I mean, I don't think that's likely, but I'm just saying he's like,
or 17? Even an inch.
Yeah, I mean, are we seriously going to play a 6'10" tackle, Mark? I mean, I'd be concerned about. I mean, seriously, I'd be concerned about that because that's out of your control. Unless they have reason to believe, even if he's not grown for the last year, and I don't know his history because I haven't dove into it as much as I probably should. I don't know. It's a weird one. And then obviously Iowa fans know that they're in the top 2 for Caden Proctor, so you could potentially have Proctor's, I think 6'7", 6'8", somewhere in there. You could potentially have, a couple guys who were 6'8", 6'9", coming in at tackle in 23. But anything else for Alec, Mark, before we let him slide?
Well, I've got one other thing. And speaking of Minnesota, Alex mentioned their, offensive line. I cannot recall the player's name that had played very little football that was recruited and signed by Minnesota and turned out to be an all Big Ten player at 6'9". For Minnesota, just a mammoth human being, over 400 pounds. So yes, it's possible. Alec, the last thing I'll hit you with is, by my evaluation, Illinois and Brett Bielema's first year was highly successful. For that team to go 4-5 in a strong conference, 5-7 overall, to beat Penn State. They had a bad year. They had an off year, but still they have a top 10 talented roster in the nation. They beat Penn State. They beat a Minnesota team that went 9-4. They blow out their rival at the end of the year. They beat Nebraska, who's considered by most to be on paper a much better team than Illinois. I just thought it was a remarkable season, even though, yes, the passing offense made it look extremely ugly and brutal at times. It was tough to watch Illinois try to eke out a first down at times, but the bottom line was 4 impressive wins there. And however, coming out of that success on the field, you talked about the recruiting, and yeah, it's a developmental program, and that's what the Big Ten West is, top to bottom, basically. And the success that Minnesota and Iowa and others now have achieved is you take top 35 to 40 recruiting classes and you build them into top 15 teams. But this recruiting class, the numbers are large with 26, and I'm talking about the 22 class, didn't sign a player. And this hit me across the face when I was watching the Big Ten Network's coverage of National Signing Day, and they were reviewing and you see all the classes lined up against each other, and you see where this is by far, from a metric standpoint, the worst class in the Big Ten.
It's not a great class, but I think it's a decent foundational class with certain guys that they were able to land. Just to name a few. Aiden Lawfrey, that was a big win for Illinois. They won him over Iowa. That's something that Illinois needs to kind of do on a more consistent basis with players. Jared Beatty is someone that they're really high on, an outside linebacker. They believe he can potentially be an NFL player. They're also really high on another outside linebacker they signed in this class, Gabe Hawkes, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. Both of those two outside linebackers were pursued pretty heavily by Tennessee, approaching the early signing period in December. So that those are both three pretty big wins. But then there's also some developmental prospects that didn't have a whole lot of Power 5 offers, especially on the offensive line, with guys like Joey Okla. Magnus Moller is a really interesting prospect. He's also 6'8", 6'9". He's from Denmark. He's an offensive tackle. He was kind of found somehow. They weren't planning to take another offensive lineman, and Bart Miller, Illinois' offensive line coach, saw enough of him to kind of want to mold him and bring him in. But then there's also some other interesting prospects on the offensive line. Hunter Whitenack, someone that Coach Bielema is really going to like. Same with Joey Okla. Those are two like really good prospects in terms of building a culture. And I think that's a lot of times what you want to do in your first class, your first full class. But they did get two intriguing offensive linemen on the transfer front or JUCO front. And Isaiah Adams, he's from Garden City Community College out in Kansas. Viewers might know, or you guys might know him from, not know him, but know that school from Last Chance U, season 3 and 4. And then they got another one who's really interesting in Zy Chrysler. Chrysler might have a higher ceiling. He just might need to lose a little bit of weight. He's really physical. He's really aggressive offensive lineman, can play guard or tackle. Same with Adams. But yeah, it's definitely not like the most eye-opening class where you're going to look at it and be like, wow, that is a great class. That is an awesome first class for Illinois. But there's pieces in this class that you feel like you can build off of. Sean Miller's another one at wide receiver who probably is going to contribute a lot this year as a freshman. A lot of that might have to do with the fact that Illinois' wide receiver room is still one of the worst in the Power 5 in the entire country. But there's other developmental guys that they think could be talented at wide receiver. Ian Pugh just needs to put on a little bit of weight, but could be a good player for them down the years at wide receiver. And another in-state kid. Jordan Anderson is one of the most, I mean, you think like Brett Bielema running back, there you go. I mean, the kid's like 6'3", 6'4", weighs a good 220 pounds. If you want to watch him run over people on his huddle film, you won't get tired of it because it just keeps happening over and over.
John Clay-esque.
Yes, very John Clay-esque. But he's got some speed to him as well. I'm big on Jordan Anderson. I think he's got the potential to be a really good player. And Lawfrey's kind of like that speedy, lightning quick guy that they're really high on. It's just a really interesting class. The quarterback in the class is Donovan Leary. He comes from New Jersey. And the interesting aspect with that is, yeah, he's a Bielema quarterback recruit and signee, but he's not a Barry Lunny signee at quarterback. So is that Lenny's guy? We don't really know yet. I think Illinois is probably going to end up in the portal again in a year from now for another quarterback. And I guess maybe I'll leave it with you guys on this. If Illinois football is going to take the next step from a team that hovers around 6-6, under 6-6, struggling to get to bowl games, and quite frankly, getting to bowl games shouldn't be as hard as Illinois has made it look in the 21st century and over the last decade, to be more specific, they need to find a stable quarterback. They've basically gone the transfer market for a quarterback since Nate Schulhouse left the program in 2013. We're pushing a decade on transfer quarterbacks. And
they've also just dealt with health problems, right? Brandon Peters couldn't stay healthy. Sikowski's, I mean, they just can't stay healthy at the position.
Yeah, Wes Lunt, another guy who couldn't stay healthy. They had a quarterback retire and Chase Crouch because of injuries. And now Crouch wasn't very good, but still, like, to have that happen, it's tough to be successful in a college program. We don't have stable quarterback play. And a lot of that comes from a lot of the head coaching turnover that Illinois had in the last decade, and offensive coordinator turnover they've had too. But if they can find a quarterback, and this goes for every program, right? Like, their floor just elevates a lot. And while DeVito could get them to a bowl game this year, he's only got one more year of eligibility. So the ceiling of Illinois football is not high right now, but it seems to be going up based off of what Bielema's done. But if he's able to get the right quarterback in situation, the offense takes some steps this year, I think a bowl game's possible. But I don't think it's something I would guarantee. I think closer to 5-7, 4-8 again this year.